Hello, my name is Irina Orishkova and I am your nonprofit auditor. Welcome to our next nap. Friendly reminder for those who don't know who we are, I am an auditor that specializes in serving nonprofit organizations. I develop NAPs, stands for Nonprofit Auditor Points, to talk to nonprofits about important accounting and auditing issues. We see ourselves as partners to nonprofit organizations, so hopefully you will find these NAPs beneficial for the board members, for the accounting staff, and to the management. Disclaimer, these NAPs are not authoritative nature. I created these NAPs just share my experience and knowledge with nonprofits. Let's start. Today I decided to talk about promises. Why? To understand what constitute promises is very critical for nonprofit organizations, because that's directly related to the revenue recognition of contributions, gifts, and pledges. What is promise for nonprofits? Promise, if it's a promise, unconditional promise to give either cash or any other assets, that becomes a revenue for nonprofit as soon as this promise is made. Unconditional promise. Not when the cash received, but when the promise is made. Under accrual method of accounting, revenue for contributions, gifts, and pledges is recognized when the promise was unconditional and when it's made. Very important. Let's talk about the grant agreements. Very often, grant agreement or promise or contribution agreement has a promise inside. You as a nonprofit need to decide, is it really promise? Does it has any condition? And when nonprofit needs to record as a revenue. Therefore, you do need to take a look in the conditions. What is the condition? Condition, it's some event or some action that need to take place before this promise becomes unconditional. What it means that nonprofit has no rights to these funds until this condition exists. Revenue recognition relates to the nonprofit right to this money. One very critical point, every grant agreement has the schedule of cash payment, of payment of the funds under the agreement. And those payments might have their own schedule how they will be paid. The cash payments are not related to the revenue recognition. They related how nonprofit will be receiving funds. However, for the revenue recognition, we need to look in the rights to nonprofit to these funds. Does not matter how and when they will be paid. It's very critical to look in the grant agreement and understand when nonprofit has a rights to these funds and when and how this money will be paid. Payments only relate when nonprofit will receive cash and absolutely not related to the revenue recognition. Once again, revenue recognition, it's nonprofit rights to the funds. Conditions. Let me give an example to mostly common condition. Condition can be when the donor indicates the nonprofit will have a right to these funds if they will solicit similar or different additional source of funds. It's called matching condition. For example, the donor will say, we will give you $100,000 if you raise another grant for $50,000 for the same purpose, for example. Until nonprofit meets that condition, nonprofit has no rights to this grant, even though nonprofit has a grant agreement. Another very common condition, when donor will say there has specific event have to take place. For example, donor will say, I will give you $1 million for this program if you hire the scientists, or if nonprofit opens the lab in Sacramento, or if nonprofit will sign the contract with somebody else to perform these services. There has to be some action done, performance done by nonprofit in order for nonprofit to have rights to this money. Donor can also say that we will give you money if by 2026 you open location in Oakland. So it could be specific performance, but also a specific time. It's not restriction, it's a condition. So if you open the office in downtown Oakland by 2025, we will give you $1 million. Donor can also say that we will give you $1 million if you become a licensed in a state to do these services. So if nonprofit does not have a license, they will not receive the money. So only after nonprofit become licensed, then the funds will be received. So these are very common conditions that needs to be made before nonprofit will have rights to these funds. But as soon as nonprofit has rights, meaning condition is substantially met, nonprofits have to record the full amount of unconditional promise as a revenue, regardless whether funds were received or not. If they were not received, it will be receivable. If they were already received before nonprofit has a rights to these funds, they should have been recorded as advances, as a liability, and after condition is met, advance liability will be moved to revenue. One more important point. Cash payment schedule on a grant agreement is not related to the revenue recognition. It's just description how funds will be paid. Very often, we hear two different terms, condition and contingent grant. And they're pretty much the same. But condition is description of the event that needs to happen, the hurdle itself that prohibits nonprofit to recognize revenue. And conditional grant or contingent grant is description of the grant, and it typically comes from the foundation's contingent grant. So therefore, contingent grant should have a condition inside. Very important to understand that what does it mean to have a condition? It means that it's not really promise, because it can, you can think about it in terms of illusory promise. It would be, for example, if I, as a donor, will promise to give my car to nonprofit if I don't change my mind tomorrow. Is it truly a promise? No, it's illusory promise. Tomorrow I might not feel like it. Therefore, it's not really a promise. Conditions create lack of obligations and uncertainties, and no real commitment. Sometimes nonprofits do receive a grant when it says, when a donor in sole discretion can stop paying on a multi-year grant if something happens. And typically, if those events that happens are vague and the donor can decide in their sole discretion to stop payment, it means that it's illusory promise. Donor can stop paying because they don't have sufficient funds, because something changed in operations, because they don't want to support nonprofit any longer, and it's an illusory promise. This promise cannot be enforced any longer. The promise has to be very clear understanding between donor and donee, promisor and promisee, that this is the promise. And no additional things, conditions, events, performances needs to happen in order for nonprofits to have rights to these funds. So as soon as unconditionally promised, the donor is obligated to pay to nonprofit the funds. If the donor still have some ways to back off from that promise, it's not a real promise. Or if a donor put any condition that needs to be happening, it is a promise, but it's a conditional promise, and something needs to happen. One important point, it's not always nonprofit needs to meet this condition. Sometimes condition can be independent from nonprofit. For example, donor might say, we will give you $1 million if the city will make this legal activity. Maybe that activity was not permitted in a city now, and it's a new law, and there's expectation that city will allow that activity, and the nonprofit and the donor will say, if the law will pass and it will become a legal activity, then we will give you $1 million. So there is nothing nonprofit can do, but there is event that needs to happen in order for that to become a promise. So very often, it's not necessarily that nonprofit needs to do something. One important point: simple administrative tasks such as submission of periodical reports, progress reports, or signing an agreement do not constitute a condition, because they just simple administrative tasks. Conditions typically very measurable and pretty defined, that something needs to happen. Simple administrative tasks do not create a condition. Therefore, as the auditor, I would invite management and accounting department read every grant carefully to understand the rights of nonprofit to these funds. To understand, is there any condition in agreement that actually prohibits nonprofit to record this as a revenue in full? And if there is no condition, then nonprofit can record them revenue and see if there's any restriction to the funds, how they can be spent by purpose or by time. But restrictions only comes after it's a revenue. Reading the grant agreement is very critical. As an auditor, I would say 80% of our clients from time to time has misreading contracts. And it happens very often. Contracts, grant agreements, they might have different names. It happens very often because either full agreement is not available to the accounting department, and they did not see all the conditions that outline in appendices, and maybe they just read the email address when it says, congratulations, we're awarding you $500,000, but it's not enough. Email is just simple notification. The true conditions, agreement, and restrictions of the funds, budget, and everything else is listed on the grant letter. It's very critical for nonprofit to preserve all grant letter contracts agreements for every stream of revenue nonprofit receives, not just simply have email congratulations. To summarize, for nonprofits, revenue recognition, one of the most critical areas. And it's very material because very often multi-year grants create material mistakes or significantly increase or decrease revenue. Therefore, compliance with the grant letters, very important. Nonprofits have to develop system of internal control to make sure to preserve grant letters for every contribution or pledge. Read it in details to understand when nonprofit have a right to the funds. Do not confuse right to the funds with the payment schedules, and record revenue when it's unconditionally promised in full as soon as the promise is made. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here, and see you for the next snap.